Welcome to this Spring Harvest at Home seminar, Rethinking Poverty in the UK in the light of the early days of the coronavirus pandemic. My name is Paul Butler. I'm the Church of England Bishop of Durham, and as such I also have the privilege of having a seat in the House of Lords, where I spend some of my time working on issues of poverty and welfare in the UK and globally. I was scheduled to present two seminars at Harrogate on poverty issues. When I was asked if I could do something for the at home, I was delighted to be able to say yes, but thought maybe I've only got the time to do one now because of everything else that's going on. Nobody told us that a pandemic was going to create quite so much administration for church leaders. But also I thought here's an opportunity to reflect, even though it's very early days, on what's already happening to us as a nation in terms of poverty, in the light of the economic crisis that the pandemic has itself created. Now, I might be entirely wrong, but I think there's already evidence to suggest that we will rethink our attitude to poverty in a range of ways when we come out the other side of the current crisis. And I think those changes will be permanent. So let's begin, but let's begin by praying. I'm going to use a prayer based on verses from Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, and it's using the New International Reader's Version. So let's pray. Loving God, you are the greatest God of all. You are the great God. You are mighty and wonderful. You treat everyone the same. You stand up for widows and for children whose fathers have died. You love outsiders, giving them food and clothes. Guide us in our thinking to know how we best love you by loving the poor, the needy and the vulnerable, whoever they may be. Deepen our understanding of your calling on us to serve the poor. We pray in the name of the one who had nowhere to lay his head, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So before I get into reflecting on the current changing picture, a brief reminder of the biblical foundations from which we work. God is the God who calls for justice for the poor. In the Old Testament, sometimes this is clearly specified as the fatherless, the widows and the sojourners, and sometimes more generically, the poor. This is clearly because in the way that Israel was structured, it was those who lost their husbands and their dads, and those who chose to live with the Israelites from a non-Jewish background who were least provided for, and least able often to help themselves. The book of Ruth gloriously combines a good example of how this worked out for both two widows, Naomi, Jewish, and Ruth, a Moabite and therefore an outsider. This story also illustrates that the way the law operated was not all about dependency and handouts. The fields were not harvested to the very edges, and the last grain of fragments were not collected, so that those in need could gather for themselves. So, no maximisation of profits for the landowners, but equally, the poor were expected to take up the opportunity afforded and work for themselves by gleaning so that they could provide for their own family needs. There was both social provision that was intended to be generous and also self-respect for the needy through the dignity of work and caring for themselves and their family. These, of course, are the gleaning laws found in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24 being worked out in action. In Ruth's case, there is additional generosity from Boaz. In the Old Testament too, there is an absolute commitment to equal justice for all, and the poor are definitely not to be mistreated. Take a look, for example, at Exodus 22, verses 21 to 27. The prophets from Hosea and Amos through Isaiah and Jeremiah to Zechariah and Malachi all inveigh against the rulers of Israel for their failure to uphold justice and their exploitation of the poor. Take a look at Amos 4, 5, 8, Isaiah 1, 58, Jeremiah 5, Zechariah 7, just as examples. Psalm 72 makes it quite clear that a good ruler is committed to justice for the poor. Then, in the Old Testament law, we have both the Sabbath and the Jubilee. Every 7 years, the land was to have rest. Every 50th year, the land was to return to the original ownership, whatever had happened to it through trading in the intervening period. Here was a vision of maintaining justice for the earth itself, not just for human beings, and justice for all people, so that inequalities get wiped out on a regular basis. The Jubilee Vision surely lies underneath the great visions of the kingdom held out by the prophets, where all creation dwells at peace, where all people are treated with justice, where suffering is no more. It lies behind Isaiah 61, which Jesus uses at the beginning of his ministry to declare what his purpose is. You can take a look also at Isaiah 11 and 65, Zechariah 8, Malachi chapter 4. These visions feed into the great vision at the end of the Bible of Revelation 21 and 22. Now, Jesus lived out this vision for those on the edge of society. His whole public ministry reached out to those who were marginalised. He reached out to women and children. He touched the lepers. He cleansed a woman excluded because of bleeding from the womb, thus making her unclean. He fed the hungry. He comforted the widow. He welcomed sinners. He restored those who were outsiders. A Samaritan woman, a Syrophoenician woman, and her daughter, a Roman centurion. He taught clearly that living out God's kingdom values means feeding the hungry, providing water for the thirsty, clothing the naked, visiting the sick and the prisoner. That's Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats. He made it clear that whilst he would accept unjust treatment himself, and anticipated that this would also happen to his followers, that those who exercise such power should do so under God and ought to pursue truth and justice. The early church was marked out by its care for the poor. One clear point Paul and Peter were totally agreed on when exploring their differences, as Paul recalls in his letter to Galatians. Paul says, "To remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do." Galatians 2 verse 10. Therefore, it's from this firm biblical base that we consider how best the poor are cared for, how best justice for all is pursued, how compassion for those in need is lived out, both as individuals and in society as a whole. So now, let's turn to the changing scene in the UK. How we understand and measure poverty in the UK has been undergoing some significant changes over recent years. The work of the Social Metrics Commission, based at the Legatum Institute, has offered a fresh way of measuring poverty that embraces a wider range of factors than simply financial. This is extremely helpful. As followers of Jesus, we have always wanted to say that poverty is multidimensional. It does include poverty of resource, financial poverty, but equally significant are relational poverty, poverty of opportunity, and spiritual poverty. One might have adequate income, but if the housing is poor, that makes a difference. The range of our social networks, our family and friendships are significant factors in whether or not we perceive ourselves to be poor or rich. Our sense of opportunity affects us. In the wider world of poverty thinking, people like Amartya Sen have helped the whole world grasp that poverty is truly multidimensional. This now impacts how the World Bank and the United Nations consider poverty. It's also into this realm that the Social Metrics Commission work is very valuable. It's now increasingly used in government. Baroness Philippa Stroud, who leads this work, is a Conservative peer. She's a Christian. Her husband happens to be the pastor of a church. She, along with her team, recognise that the metrics developed need to be further expanded. I argue that in particular they need to include the whole area of well-being. There is a national well-being register for adults. Sadly, at present, this does not include children and young people. Here, the Children's Society have led the way wonderfully well since 2009 with their annual Good Childhood report. The value of these pieces of work is that they now show they can track changes in perception over a decade. They clearly demonstrate that well-being is about so much more than money, but that lack of financial resource is still a significant factor in how children, young people and adults feel about their well-being. So alongside the proper hard facts around weekly income and available assets, the impact of debt and its repayment, the inescapable costs of the household like housing and food and childcare, and extra costs related to disability, it's going to be important that consideration is given to the social context and whether or not that offers equal opportunity. Consideration of the existence and quality of relationships will be needed. A recognition that how well-being is perceived is a significant factor in whether or not people recognise how they are being lifted out of poverty. Anecdotally, we all know that some people have little materially view themselves as rich in other ways. Equally, we know that some people who appear to have everything materially can be deeply poor in terms of their relationships and their well-being. All kinds of factors come into play that are harder to measure. Therefore, it is very helpful that the Social Metrics Commission itself has committed to much greater work on the lived experience of those in poverty to help deepen the understanding. From a biblical perspective, I would argue that all aspects matter. Hard facts, well calculated, help us a great deal. However, we must take into account social context, the quality of relationships people experience, and the reality of spiritual poverty, if we are to truly grasp poverty in a fully rounded way. If we concentrate exclusively on those that are easy to measure, we will have only a partial picture. Equally, if we fail to recognise the hard facts and act on them, we will not make the full impact on overall well-being that we could do with better housing and simply adequate financial provision. Now let's turn specifically to the impact of the coronavirus. We are already on a journey as a nation and as a world on redefining our understanding of poverty. This in itself would lead us to changes in how we respond. I want now to suggest that the coronavirus crisis has already created opportunities for further thinking differently. It's also highlighted a persistent problem or two. Let me highlight three key factors that have already occurred that give me confidence that there will be scope to think differently in the longer term. The first two factors are both economically. Sadly, there has been a major economic impact on large numbers of people. Around 1 million new claims for universal credit have already been made. This number will grow further. Whilst no exact analysis of who these people are has yet been made, it is quite clear that a significant number of these new claimants will be those who are entirely new to the benefit system and as claimants of universal credit. I suspect that many are people who never expected to be in such a position. Secondly, it's already clear that when we come out of the crisis, many people will be poorer. They may not have lost their jobs, but their income will have been hit. Many will have used up their savings to keep going. So more people will face poverty in some form, many for the first time in their lives. Thirdly, there has been a phenomenal piece of work to house around 4,000 street homeless people in hotels and provide them with food. Now, the first fact means that there will be a much broader awareness of universal credit as a system. This will mean a greater awareness of the challenges faced by those who have to live on the amount paid through it. Thankfully, the government acted very quickly to the crisis and raised UC and working tax credit by £20 per week. They also significantly raised the local housing allowance, So new claimants will not be as sharply hit as they would have been before the crisis. Although I have to say that those who have more than 2 children will quickly realise the detrimental impact of the 2-child limit. I think people's eyes will be opened to the reality that there were those who had no recourse to public funds, and wonder why we could ever have left some people in such a situation. People's eyes are being opened to the fact that no one is invincible to financial instability. The second fact simply means that the number in poverty, at least for a while, will be significantly higher. This in itself may change attitudes and approaches to poverty in the longer term. It is impossible to predict the economic fallout of COVID-19, but it is highly likely our economy will be hit for a very long period, and austerity will be enforced to counterbalance the Chancellor's sterling efforts to protect people during the pandemic. We must therefore prepare for more people to be driven into poverty. As poverty levels were already set to increase, particularly for children living in poverty, we must consider how our public policy interventions can remain compassionate even when the immediate threat is removed. My hope is that this time will be one of reorientation, of heightened compassion and deeper understanding. As people who 2 weeks ago had a stable income are now waiting to hear if they will be furloughed or laid off, I hope that there will be greater appreciation for the experiences of those who were in poverty prior to the crisis. I hope that this event will create a humanisation of the situation of people claiming benefits, fighting the callous rhetoric of benefit scroungers. I think it will also lead to a further and deeper debate about the concept of universal basic income. This has quietly been gaining traction in a range of political contexts. Arguably, it is a better option than the simple extension of the benefit system. This idea has some roots in the Jubilee tradition. Whatever the final economic outcomes, which will emerge in years rather than months, I pray that the whole experience will create greater empathy with those who face the reality of poverty. The third fact around homelessness must surely lead us all to ask key questions about a clearer and firmer long-term response. We dare not allow all of these people back onto the streets once the crisis is over. I'm sure that each will be supported through this period to help find a proper long-term solution to being housed and indeed being helped back into work. We will, I think, all expect a better way of tackling homelessness in the future. No one should ever spend a second night on the streets if they become homeless. This should become national policy and collaborative systems put in place to ensure it happens. I say collaborative systems because clearly one of the lessons already learned is the significance of local community responses to the crisis. The crisis has highlighted both why national government matters and why local government is vital. It has shown the significance for us as a nation of the National Health Service. It's also shown us that community groups and community response are significant. So too is business, whether that be large, medium or small. It has shown the significance of self-employment in our economy. We are rediscovering the interconnectedness of all parts of society, national and local, government, business and community, the whole voluntary charity sector. No one can do this alone. We are always in this together. The importance of community is clear in these recent weeks. The neighbour you never talked to, who seemed rude and uninterested, is now showing you great kindness by delivering your shopping and leaving you encouraging notes. The relational poverty that was growing in our communities may be reversed. Community engagement personalises the struggles of groups who are different from each other. The common, invisible threat unites disparate groups in a sense of unity. But can this have a long-lasting effect? The rhetoric sparked by Brexit has sown many seeds of division in our communities, But this crisis is an opportunity for relationships to mend. Thrown into great uncertainty, individuals and institutions across the country have reflected on their priorities. My hope is that our priorities become our community's priorities, and those are for those who are most in need. The whole has also highlighted to churches both our key role in serving communities through food banks, night shelters, community meals, preschool groups, carer and toddler groups, visiting the lonely, supporting care homes, and so much more. It's been amazing to watch church groups step up to both maintain such services and to respond creatively to having to offer this support in different ways that recognise that physical distancing is actually a way of serving my neighbour at present. The crisis also throws up some questions. Here we go. The first is around connection. The use of social media platforms like Zoom, Teams and GoToMeetings have become very widely used by a completely new range of people. Churches, local community groups and charities have also established basic telephone support systems. There is greater connection taking place. However, is this greater connection for most leading to greater alienation for some? Is social physical distancing and the ways we find around it developing an even wider gap to those who do not or cannot engage with it? This is not purely on age grounds. There are other factors like literacy, affordability and accessibility that means this impacts all ages in some way. Are we in danger of creating a new form of poverty? I've been humbled to see that as we are more physically isolated, many of us are more connected than ever before. However, this leads to another point about poverty. As we become excited about the Zoom calls and moving church online, we must ask ourselves, are we reaching the poorest? Will the person still sleeping on the street have access to a device that enables Zoom? Will the single mum of 3 who's lost her job due to being on a 0-hours contract have the means to digitally connect? How can we foster community virtually without alienating those who do not have access to the latest technology? Our creativity must extend beyond only meeting basic needs of delivering food. How can we offer deeper support to struggling families in our communities? The second question is around the sustainability of community action. Communities are currently in the throes of the heroic response to the pandemic. Because we do not have control over the invisible enemy of COVID-19, we look for ways we can feel in control. If I can just deliver this food package to my neighbour, I am fighting the good fight against the virus. I can at least be in control of the activity I'm doing to feel more control over the whole situation. But this frenzy of activity is not sustainable. In even just a month's time, it's likely that people's energy will drop as more and more people need help and fewer people possibly are able to provide it. This is likely to lead us into a disillusionment phase. We become so overwhelmed by the weight of the problem that we focus on our internal household and the ones we have strong bonds with, expending energy on them rather than on our neighbours. We become debilitated, feeling helpless. This makes sense. We need to protect our own. Nevertheless, if this pandemic continues for 3, 6 or even 12 months, how can we as Christians sustain our outward focus on those most vulnerable to the effects of the virus? How can we also emphasise that although the pandemic has exacerbated and highlighted the problems facing the poorest, it has not created many of these issues? Job losses on a national scale are not normal. However, losing the wage earner of the household due to circumstances beyond control is an experience of many Britons in the lowest income bracket as people are in insecure work. As our bodies and minds adjust to lockdown being the new normal for the next few months, how do we ensure that our tendency to become more inward-looking does not result in the poorest being forgotten both during the crisis and when things return to normal? The third question is around looking ahead and government accountability. Arguably, the creation of the job retention scheme offering up to 80% of your salary and the increase in universal credit payments are a recognition that job seekers allowance and UC payments have been insufficient and would be insufficient if we return to the previous rates. The changes that the government are implementing due to the crisis should not be forgotten afterwards. They should not be removed. It remains to be seen whether this crisis will lead to a reprioritisation of political will orientated towards the most vulnerable in society, with actions, not just words. There's a final question, and it's about our global context. Looking beyond our current context to the global community, I am particularly worried. Many countries in East Africa, where I visit regularly, have very limited medical resources such as ventilators and the ability to test for COVID-19. If the virus is ravaging rich countries, as The Guardian reports, then imagine how poor countries are being affected. Right now, the last thing on governments' minds is how they can support other countries to tackle the crisis. At a time of national emergency, we somewhat understandably become focused only on our own. However, we all know this is a global pandemic. We all recognise that mutual learning, not simply for the short term, but also for how we handle any future crisis, is vital. The danger is that the poorest will be left out, not included, ignored. Surely, though, it's the responsibility of the wealthy countries to recognise the needs of the poorest and step in to help, alongside supporting their own populations. Ultimately, the well-being of every nation matters for the well-being of the whole. We forget or ignore the poorest not only to their peril, but also potentially to our own. At a global level, God must be concerned for justice for the poorest on earth. Therefore, as God's people, we should be the same. Well, I hope this has been of value to at least get you pondering and thinking about the impact on poverty and on our thinking about poverty in the light of the early days of the coronavirus. As I said at the beginning, I might be entirely wrong. Nevertheless, I think the questions emerging are worth pursuing prayerfully, reflecting on the scriptures together and using our reason and our hearts to respond to the growing reality of poverty in our nation and the continuing reality of poverty worldwide. If you'd like to engage in discussion, then please contact me. My email address is bishop.of.durham@durham.anglican.org. bishop.of.durham@durham.anglican.org. Or you can find me on Twitter at Bishop Paul B. That's at Bishop Paul B, all lowercase. I really want to see us listen to what God might be saying to us through this time that enables us to be a people better equipped to be more like God and be with and for the poor. I want to end with a word of hope. Psalm 41 begins, "Blessed is the one who considers the poor." Mary's great song, known by many as Magnificat, still heralds that God has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. This is the God whom we worship, pray to, and serve. God is still God. He is still the God of the poor. The glorious vision of Isaiah 65, Zechariah 8, Revelation 21 is still our vision to call us on to keep working for justice for the poorest. I believe that as we go through this crisis and come out the other side, we could have very changed attitudes for the better within the church and across our nation, even the world. We could see that justice for the poor is right and we'll work for it. We could see that being community together, locally, nationally and globally, is the way God designed us to be, and build and live it for the better. We could come through this, recognizing that Jesus was right when he told us that the very best way to live is to seek first God's way of doing things, God's kingdom come, and justice, and discover that all else then falls into its proper place. Let us continue to pray. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you for listening, watching, and engaging.